Hello. Today we have a special date. It's 100th day of war. If I look back at the first days when I started recording these videos and when everything that was going on was immersed in shock and terror, it's an interesting psychological experience to look back and to analyze my own feelings, the content of these video updates I have been recording over these 100 days, and also to look how society, Ukrainian society and the world community coped with this terrible news of the war. And it's also quite interesting to compare it with what's going on today in Ukrainian society and in the international community. I want to pay attention to few points that I think are important to kind of sum up in this special day. First and obvious is that Ukraine is still holding its fronts. There were various prognoses that Ukraine will be defeated in 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. But after several days of the war, it was immediately obvious that the so-called military operation is not developing as it was planned and expected by the Russians and, to be honest, by the international community. That also did not give much chances to Ukraine to withstand the full-scale Russian aggression. Obviously, if we look at the kind of timeline of this 100 days, there were ups and downs, but the good news that we are still standing and fighting. Ukraine is incurring terrible losses, especially human losses. Many friends, many acquaintances of mine have died over this 100 days. Many people in Ukraine have lost their closest ones, either in battle as soldiers or under the bombs and shelling as civilians. You all followed that news and you all supported us. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But every day we are getting more news from the front lines about some acquaintance or even close friend who has lost his life or her life in the battle. Is extremely painful, especially that we understand that this war is a kind of a very tedious process of destroying each other human potential. Russians are sending wave by wave their soldiers to take over Ukrainian positions. Ukrainians are fighting back again, wave by wave, to hold their positions, and in that process, both sides lose a lot of people. The official Ukrainian count of Russian casualties, dead soldiers, is well over 30,000. Even if we don't trust it and call it, as some people do, official Ukrainian propaganda, it's still huge. So maybe 15,000, maybe 20,000, but in any case, it's unheard of losses for Russian army. Ukrainian losses are probably somehow similar to this number, maybe less, because we are defending and the attacking side always incurs heavier losses than those who defend. But due to heavy artillery duels, I think both sides lose a lot of people. The most painful thing for the Ukrainian side is that people who went to the front lines to defend their country are usually people with the most active, proactive civic position. People who were active in business life, in the social life, in sometimes in scholarly world. I'm not saying that all Ukrainian soldiers are like top intellectuals and businessmen, but there are many people whom we lost who were widely known to the nation as prominent people, and this is terrible. The losses of human capital, so to speak, are probably the hardest and the most painful losses, not to mention normal human emotional side of this tragedy, that we are losing our close ones and people who were supposed to live a long life and have children and build Ukrainian society. Another trait of what's going on is that the so-called special operation basically is over. Russians have long abandoned their attempts to take Ukraine by surprise. The military actions in the east and south Ukraine are very slow, very premeditated, calculated. Nothing very spontaneous is going on. We are mostly immersed into artillery fights, and from the Russian side they are also using their aviation, which we don't have, at least at that scale. And this again, it's a very technological war. Not so much soldiers that are fighting each other, but artillery, missile systems, various radio systems, drones, helicopters, fighters, jets, and so on. Which again makes this uneven battle for Ukraine, because although Western governments do send us a lot of support, financial and humanitarian, and some weapons, still Russia possesses huge arsenal of weapons, which is Ukraine is incomparable to the amount of ammunition and all the kinds of weaponry that Russians have, and we cannot compete with them in the front lines precisely because as brave as our soldiers could be, we don't have equality, parity in artillery and other effective weapons. So this makes this war longer and more bloodier, because as more days are passing by, more lives are lost, more civilians are killed, more infrastructure is destroyed. I'm sure the Western media cover this very well whenever they can film or photograph the ruins of Ukrainian cities in the south and east of Ukraine, and you know about that, but I just have no idea how the country will be rebuilt and what are economical losses for that, because some towns that were homes to like 100,000 people are literally wiped out of the face of the earth. They don't exist any longer. If you look at the drone footage of what's left, it's really just like blueprints of the buildings. You can see that there was a building there and rubbles, but nothing else, and that's for like acres and acres and kilometers of the former inhabited heavily populated cities. So it's really terrifying from the human perspective, from economic perspective, and it's clear that it's also a war to destroy Ukrainian economic capacities, Ukrainian infrastructure. Unfortunately, we are seeing a huge decline in the interest, in the international attention, media attention to this war. I'm sure the war still resonates with ordinary people, like those who are watching these videos, but generally everyone, including humanitarian aid workers or volunteers who raised money for the army, or even officials, report that generally the world is tired, the world is using focus on this war, which is natural. We don't judge you for that, obviously, because I don't think anyone in Ukrainian society was closely following war in Syria or some wars in Africa, and although we are in the center of Europe, we are getting much more attention than some other wars in recent history, but still it's understandable. People live their lives, and after more than 3 months of intense reaction to the war, it's a natural psychological reaction to kind of block negative information and stop thinking about those dead bodies and bombings and all that. So it's understandable, but again, we cannot win this war alone. We cannot win this war without attention and involvement on the part of civilized nations, and so please do support us. Unfortunately, we are hearing this kind of calls for what I call unjust peace. There are some voices in Western Europe, generally in the international media, some prominent political figures that say, okay, just forget about what happened, sit at the desk with Putin, at the table with Putin, and discuss the terms for peace agreement, whatever it can mean, after half of your country has been destroyed and 20% of your territory is occupied and will probably be officially joined, annexed to Russia in the coming weeks. So this calls for peace amounts to the calls for capitulation of Ukraine, and that's obviously is not acceptable for Ukrainian people, and we will not do that. To stimulate those calls for unjust peace, Russians use more and more threats with nuclear weapons, with even more military escalation, with blocking our ports and causing hunger in some third world countries, and so on. And unfortunately, the support we are getting from Western governments, especially from Germany, that is notoriously slow and ambiguous in its support of Ukraine, in its military support of Ukraine, it's insufficient what we are receiving, simply because, as I said, we are so heavily outweighed by Russian military power that without active and effective military support by weapons, not by soldiers, but by weapons from the West, we cannot win this war. So every day of delays, of unnecessary bureaucratic or political discussions about various nuances of this aid to Ukraine, it means losses of hundreds of lives of soldiers and civilians on both sides, on Ukrainian side and on the Russian side. Russia is using continuing terror, continuing escalation of its brutal military power, but also we are hearing more and more reports about repressions against the civilians who found themselves trapped under the Russian occupation in various parts, especially in the southern Ukraine, in Kherson region, in the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. People are being kidnapped, executed, lose their civil rights because of Russian army not recognizing Ukrainian documents, Ukrainian generally human rights, and that leads to a very dire situation, and we are all afraid that we will be seeing more and more of those Bucha style massacres and mass graves, as we are already seeing in some parts of Ukraine. I'm going to show you just a couple of pictures and videos from Mariupol. It kind of disappeared from the headlines of the news agencies because the city has been captured. The soldiers from Azov are basically taken prisoners of war and kept in the Donetsk, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic territory. As far as we know, they are treated all right as prisoners of war, but there is no yet any hope for their exchange for the Russian prisoners of war from our side. We will see how this develops with the Azov regiment and other military guys who were bravely defending the city of Mariupol. But there are so to speak, interesting things happening in Mariupol, really terrible things happening there, that more and more rubbles are cleared out by Russians. They find a lot of dead bodies under the ruins of every building in the city. Sometimes they find like 6 bodies, sometimes like 20 bodies in one huge building that collapsed, and those bodies are evacuated kind of secretly. They are not being accounted for and either burned or buried in special cemeteries. Sometimes people, relatives, just place signs like this listing. You can see 5 people with the same family name, so obviously one family, father and mother of 1974 year of birth, and then 2 children, 2007 and 2010, who all of them died in one day, 17th of March of this year. So their bodies are under the rubbles. It will take maybe months for all those rubbles to be cleared, and so relatives just put this sign as if it were a grave of the family. There leaked a video of Mariupol, drone footage that shows the destruction of the city, but the most shocking part of it is footage of a large improvised cemetery that is used for mass graves of the victims whose bodies were extracted from the ruins of the city. So far, officially, they are reporting about 25,000 civilians who died in Mariupol, but after the discoveries of those cemeteries, there are more and more discovered in the process because they are secretly organized by the occupying Russian authorities. So after the discovery of those graves, and you can see they are huge, they have like thousands of graves. People are buried not even in graves but in trenches. So after the discovery of this, the number of the casualties will jump up. We do not know by how many persons, but probably to at least 30,000 dead. And now it's even impossible to say how many people died there, because Russia will play the card that most of people are still alive but fled to Russia or are displaced to the Russian territory, and they will never emerge, so to speak, from there. So it's impossible for the relatives today to locate their relatives who stayed in Mariupol, and whether they are dead or alive, it's really very hard to say, and we do not know if it will ever be possible to definitely prove that certain person died under the bombs in Mariupol. So this is kind of sad summary of what's going on. It's very clear, and many people in the Ukrainian society came to understood recently that this war will be very long, not as we expected it initially to last weeks or months, but it might last for many more months. We do not know how many. And as always, I end my video with the request of your support, your prayers, your attention to what we are doing, and we really hope that with Lord's help and with the help of the international community, the brave Ukrainian soldiers will be able to save our country from this invasion. Thank you for watching.